What would you do if the system you dedicated your life to serving turned against you? For District Attorney Marcus Hale, it started as an ordinary night, a quiet walk home after a long day of preparing for a high-stakes corruption case. But everything changed when two officers stopped him on a dark street, accusing him of a crime he didn't commit. What began as routine police stop unraveled into a dangerous conspiracy reaching the highest levels of power. Marcus soon discovered that his wrongful arrest was no accident. It was part of a carefully orchestrated plan to silence him and bury the evidence he was about to uncover. As Marcus fights to clear his name, he finds himself up against a network of corruption, betrayal, and desperation, a determined ally, a haunted whistleblower, and a relentless senator with everything to lose. These are the players in a game where the stakes are life and death. But in a world where even allies can't be trusted, who will stand with Marcus when the final truths are revealed? The night was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that made Marcus Hale feel the weight of his thoughts. His leather shoes tapped rhythmically against the pavement as he walked down Evergreen Lane, the cold air biting at his skin. After an exhausting day of legal strategy meetings and prepping for the corruption trial against State Senator Richard Langston, all Marcus wanted was to get home, pour a glass of bourbon, and let the silence embrace him. The golden glow of streetlights bathed the sidewalk, their flickering barely noticed by Marcus as his mind replayed the closing arguments he was preparing. His briefcase, filled with documents that could dismantle a career built on deceit, swung at his side. As Marcus rounded the final corner before his street, red and blue lights slashed across the darkness. A squad car sped toward him and came to a screeching halt. Marcus blinked, his hand instinctively tightening on the strap of his briefcase. "Evening, sir," a voice called out. Officer Barnes stepped out of the vehicle. He was stocky, with sharp eyes that gleamed with something between amusement and suspicion. His hand rested lazily on his holster. Following him was Officer Grant, a lanky man who hesitated near the driver's door, his gaze darting between Barnes and Marcus. Marcus raised his hand slightly, a calm, practiced motion meant to diffuse any tension. "Good evening, officers. Can I help you?" Barnes folded his arms and tilted his head. "Got a call about a break-in down the street. You fit the description." Marcus felt a slow heat building in his chest. He forced himself to remain steady. "A break-in?" He gestured to his tailored coat and polished shoes. "I just left my office downtown. I'm the district attorney for this county." Barnes's smirk widened. "District attorney, huh? Fancy title, but titles don't mean much to me." Marcus clenched his teeth, but kept his voice even. "I'm carrying legal documents. You're welcome to check." Before he could finish, Barnes snatched the briefcase from his hand. The latches popped open, and a flurry of papers scattered onto the ground. Case files, sealed affidavits, and witness statements fluttered like autumn leaves across the pavement. "Careful!" Marcus snapped, stepping forward. Barnes raised a hand. "Easy there. No need to get aggressive." He bent down, picking up a document. His eyes scanned the page before he let out a mocking whistle. "Well, look at that. You really went all out to look like you're some big shot." Grant shuffled awkwardly, his hand hovering near his radio. He seemed to be at war with himself. "This is harassment," Marcus said, his patience thinning. Barnes straightened and stepped closer. "That's for us to decide. Turn around. Hands behind your back." Marcus's pulse quickened. "On what grounds?" Barnes's grin twisted into something sharper. "Resisting an officer," he growled. "Let's see what else we can add." Marcus felt a hand clamp down on his shoulder. He twisted slightly, but Barnes shoved him forward, his wrist catching painfully as the cold metal of handcuffs clamped around them. "Officer Grant," Barnes barked. "Call it in." Grant's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. He hesitated, then reluctantly brought his radio to his mouth. "Dispatch, we have a suspect." His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. The squad car's door slammed shut behind Marcus, as he was shoved into the back seat. The weight of the situation settled on his chest, but it wasn't fear that fueled his rapid heartbeat. It was anger. The lights of the city blurred past as the car sped toward the station. Marcus kept his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, where Grant's gaze flicked up nervously. Marcus's mind was already working, planning his next move. The injustice wasn't new to him. He had spent years dismantling corrupt officers and power-hungry politicians. But now, he was in the center of the web. He wasn't just a prosecutor anymore. He was a case. As they pulled into the station parking lot, Barnes whistled cheerfully. "Hope you like cold coffee and steel bars," he said, as he yanked the door open. Marcus stepped out with as much dignity as he could muster, his chin lifted. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Barnes's smile faltered for just a second. "I think I do," he muttered. Marcus allowed himself a small, defiant smile. "So do I," he thought. The moment the steel cell door clanged shut behind him, Marcus sat on the cold bench and took a slow breath. His handcuffed wrists rested on his lap, but his thoughts were already racing ahead. They had no idea what they had just started. The heavy clang of the cell door echoed through the station like a gunshot. Marcus Hale sat on the cold steel bench, his back pressed against the concrete wall. The sterile scent of disinfectant hung in the air, mixing with the bitter aroma of burnt coffee. Overhead, the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting harsh shadows that danced across the peeling paint. He rotated his wrists, trying to soothe the dull ache from the handcuffs. The chill from the metal bars seeped into his skin, but his mind was burning with anger. Marcus wasn't a man who frightened easily. He had stood face to face with criminals in the courtroom for years. But tonight, the reality of how quickly the roles could reverse was suffocating. Outside the cell, Officer Barnes strolled past with an air of smug satisfaction. He tossed Marcus's wallet and phone onto a desk with a hollow thud, as though they were trophies of his conquest. "Got anything else to say, Mr. District Attorney?" Barnes asked, leaning against the doorframe. His grin was wide and sharp, like a wolf circling its prey. Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "Plenty, but I'll save it for the courtroom." Barnes's grin faltered, just for a second. "Good luck with that," he muttered, before turning toward the front desk. From his place by the door, Officer Grant watched the interaction in silence. His arms were crossed, but his posture was stiff, like someone holding his breath in a room filled with smoke. His eyes briefly met Marcus's, and for a fleeting moment, there was something in his expression, regret, maybe, or shame. Barnes slapped Grant on the back as he passed. "Another one off the streets," he said with a satisfied chuckle. "Bet he thought his title would get him out of this." Grant didn't laugh. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and moved away. Marcus leaned forward, clasping his hands. He knew men like Barnes' men who thrived on power trips and thrived even more when they could disguise their abuses as just doing the job. But there was something about Grant that Marcus couldn't quite place. The younger officer looked out of his depth, like a man wrestling with the weight of a decision he couldn't take back. Time moved slowly in the cell. Minutes dragged into an hour, and Marcus forced himself to stay calm. Losing his temper wouldn't help. The walls might have been thin, but in situations like this, silence could be just as damning as the truth. Finally, a guard approached. "You get one call," the man said flatly, unlocking the cell door. Marcus stood slowly, stretching his stiff legs. He followed the guard to a small desk near the booking station. There, an old landline phone waited, its coiled cord tangled like a knot of secrets. Marcus picked up the receiver and dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Alexis Moore," came the sharp, professional tone. Marcus exhaled slowly. "It's me." There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "Marcus, what happened?" "I've been arrested," Marcus said evenly. The silence that followed was heavy. Then Alexis's voice came, low and urgent. "Tell me everything." Marcus kept his tone calm but precise as he explained the encounter, the bogus burglary report, Barnes's attitude, the unnecessary escalation. When he was done, Alexis's fury was palpable through the line. "They made a huge mistake," she said. "I'm bringing the files. All of them." "Good," Marcus replied. "There's something else." He lowered his voice, mindful of the ears nearby. "I need you to dig into Barnes's record. Find anything complaints, old cases, use of force reports. If there's dirt, I want it." "You got it," Alexis said without hesitation. "I'm on my way." The line went dead. Marcus set the phone down and straightened, feeling the first flicker of hope since the night began. As he was led back to his cell, Marcus caught sight of Grant standing near the hallway, arms folded tight across his chest. Their eyes met again, and this time Marcus didn't look away. Neither did Grant. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words. "What are you waiting for?" Marcus's eyes seemed to say. Grant blinked, his face tightening, but then he turned and walked away. In the solitude of his cell, Marcus sat down again, resting his elbows on his knees. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with resolve. He knew Alexis would come through, but he also knew that Barnes wasn't working alone. This wasn't just a traffic stop gone wrong, it was something bigger. Through the bars, Marcus could hear Barnes laughing with another officer down the hall. "Won't be long before the court throws the book at him," Barnes said, his voice carrying. "Let's see how smug he looks then." Marcus's lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't the one who should be afraid. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The low hum of the station filled the silence as Marcus sat on the cold bench, waiting. He glanced at the clock mounted on the far wall. It had only been 30 minutes since his phone call, but each second felt like an hour. He imagined Alexis speeding through the city, her mind racing as she prepared for what was bound to be a fight. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Marcus straightened as Alexis Moore appeared at the booking desk, her blazer slightly wrinkled, a determined fire blazing in her eyes. She was holding a thick folder, nearly bursting with documents. The officer at the desk barely had time to greet her before she marched past. "Release him," Alexis demanded, her voice steady but sharp enough to cut through the room. "Now!" Barnes sauntered in, wiping his hands with a paper towel, as if he'd just finished a leisurely meal. "Well, if it isn't the cavalry." His smirk widened. "You're too late. He's already been processed." Alexis placed the folder on the desk with a loud thud. "This is everything you need to clear him. Time-stamped proof that Marcus was at his office during the supposed break-in, plus a sworn affidavit from the building security guard." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Barnes. "If you don't uncuff him in the next 5 minutes, I'll personally call the state attorney general and have your entire department audited." Barnes's grin faltered for a second before returning. "You think you can strong-arm me?" "No," Alexis replied coolly. "I think the facts can." The desk sergeant flipped through the documents, his expression growing grim. Marcus watched carefully as Barnes's bravado began to crack, the weight of the evidence pressing down on him. Just as the sergeant reached for the keys to the cell, a uniformed officer hurried over, holding up his phone. His face was pale. Sir?" the officer stammered, handing the phone to Barnes. "You need to see this." Barnes snatched the phone and played the video, his face slowly draining of color. The grainy footage showed Marcus walking down the street, briefcase in hand, unbothered, unthreatening. The next shot showed Barnes's cruiser speeding toward him, lights flashing. But the angle wasn't from a security camera. It was filmed from the shadows, shaky but unmistakable. Marcus leaned closer, narrowing his eyes. "Where did this come from?" The officer hesitated. "It was sent anonymously." Barnes stared at the phone, veins bulging at his temples. He spun toward Grant, who had been watching silently near the doorway. "Did you know about this?" Barnes barked. Grant raised his hands slightly, his face pale but calm. No, but maybe someone else saw what happened. Alexis crossed her arms, suspicion flickering in her eyes. It's curious timing, she murmured. Marcus's mind raced. Whoever had filmed that video had been close enough to see everything but remain hidden. The thought sent a chill through him. Send that video to my legal team, he told Alexis, and back it up. Barnes clenched his fists, his composure slipping. You're not walking out of here without repercussions, he spat. Marcus stepped forward, closing the space between them. Despite the slight bruise forming on his wrist, his posture was strong. Oh, I'm walking out of here, he said quietly, and you're the one who should be worried. For the first time that night, Barnes didn't have a comeback. He turned sharply and stormed out of the room. The cell door clicked open, and Marcus stepped out. Alexis handed him his briefcase, then spoke low enough for only him to hear. Someone went out of their way to help you tonight. But who? Marcus shook his head. That's what I intend to find out. As they left the station, Marcus felt the cool night air hit his face. He took a deep breath, grateful to be free but filled with questions. The anonymous footage was no coincidence. Someone out there was watching, and they had chosen to intervene. But why? Was it an ally, or someone playing their own game? Back inside the station, Grant stood alone in the hallway, his hands shaking slightly. The words of Marcus's final glance echoed in his head. What are you waiting for? Grant closed his eyes briefly, then pulled out his phone. He hesitated for a long moment before tapping a name in his contacts. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. You're late, the voice said, calm but firm. I know, Grant muttered, but things are spiraling. Barnes won't hold this together much longer. A pause. Then, the voice replied, stick to the plan. And remember, he's more important than you think. Grant swallowed hard. Understood. The line went dead. The courtroom was packed the following week. The case against Officer Barnes had attracted a storm of media attention. Spectators filled the benches, their whispers like a low hum of static. Journalists angled their cameras for a perfect shot of the man who had been both a hero in the fight against corruption and its latest victim. Marcus Hale sat at the defense table, calm and composed. His navy suit was pressed to perfection, his tie straight and understated. Despite the chaos surrounding him, he exuded quiet authority. His legal pad lay untouched. He didn't need notes for what was about to happen. Across the aisle, Barnes lounged in his chair with an air of smugness, as if the courtroom were a stage built just for him. His attorney, Patricia Reynolds, was a sharp-eyed prosecutor who'd built her career on aggressive, tough-on-crime tactics. When the judge entered and called the court to order, the murmurs settled into silence. People of the state versus Officer James Barnes, the clerk announced. Patricia rose, her tailored suit as sharp as her expression. The state will prove that Officer Barnes acted within the boundaries of law enforcement and had reasonable suspicion to detain Mr. Hale. Marcus listened carefully, though nothing she said surprised him. The prosecution's strategy was simple: paint him as combative, someone who escalated the situation. When Patricia finished, the judge turned to Marcus. Mr. Hale, you may proceed. Marcus stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate precision. The room seemed to hold its breath. Your Honor, Marcus began, his voice steady, I will be representing myself. A ripple of astonishment spread through the room. Patricia blinked in surprise, quickly masking it with a frown. Barnes's smirk faltered, as if realizing he'd underestimated his opponent. Marcus walked toward the jury, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, meeting their eyes, this is not just a case about one man being detained. This is about accountability, about what happens when those sworn to protect us use their power as a weapon instead of a shield. The jury was still, captivated by his words. Marcus continued, his tone measured but cutting. The prosecution would have you believe that this was a lawful stop, but the evidence tells a different story. He pressed a remote, and the courtroom monitor lit up. Grainy but clear, the anonymous video played for all to see. The room fell into stunned silence as they watched Barnes's patrol car pull up beside Marcus on the quiet street. There was no call for backup, no urgency, just two officers cornering a man without cause. The jury's expressions shifted, curiosity turned into doubt. When the video ended, Marcus turned toward the witness stand. "I call Officer Grant to testify." Grant hesitated as he stood, his face pale under the courtroom lights. He walked slowly to the stand, his shoulders hunched as though weighed down by an invisible burden. After he was sworn in, Marcus approached him. His voice was calm but firm. "Officer Grant, can you describe the events of that night?" Grant's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. We received a call about a burglary." Marcus nodded. "And did you personally see anything that indicated I was involved in a crime?" Grant's hands trembled slightly. "No." The room tensed. Marcus pressed forward. "So why was I stopped?" Grant's eyes darted toward Barnes, who glared at him, his knuckles white against the table. The pressure in the room was palpable. "Because," Grant's voice cracked. He exhaled shakily, then spoke louder, as if freeing himself. "Because Barnes told me to make it look legitimate." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge banged his gavel for order, but the damage was done. The truth, like a detonated secret, rippled through the room. Barnes shot to his feet. "He's lying," he barked. "This is a setup." Marcus didn't flinch. He held up his hand, and the courtroom fell silent again. "Officer Grant," he said calmly, "is there any evidence that supports your claim?" Grant nodded, pulling a small recording device from his pocket. "I was scared, but I recorded everything." A collective gasp filled the room. Marcus stepped aside as the audio played. Barnes's voice echoed through the speakers, cold and unmistakable. "Just make it look clean. No one's gonna question it." The courtroom froze. Patricia Reynolds's face went pale. She stood, scrambling for an objection, but the judge overruled her. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. The gavel struck again. "We'll take a recess." Marcus turned back to his seat, but not before locking eyes with Barnes one final time. The bravado that Barnes had worn like armor was gone, replaced by raw panic. As Marcus sat down, Alexis leaned in. "You really knew Grant would break, huh?" Marcus's expression was unreadable. "I knew he wasn't Barnes. He still has a conscience." Alexis nodded, but her brow furrowed. "That anonymous video. It's helping us, but we still don't know who sent it." Marcus's gaze drifted toward the windows, where the city skyline loomed like a shadowed reminder. "We'll find out," he said quietly. "Because whoever they are, they're not done yet." The courtroom buzzed like a live wire as everyone filed out for the recess. Reporters scrambled to send updates while spectators whispered, their eyes darting toward Barnes, who now sat rigid, staring ahead as though refusing to accept his reality. His attorney, Patricia Reynolds, was whispering fiercely in his ear, but her words barely seemed to register. Marcus Hale stood at the defense table, calm but alert. His instincts told him this wasn't over. Barnes might have been exposed, but something deeper was at play, something larger than one rogue officer abusing his badge. Alexis walked over and handed Marcus a bottle of water. "You should see their faces out there," she murmured. "It's like they're watching a movie." Marcus took a small sip and set the bottle down. "The third act hasn't started yet." Alexis's expression darkened. "Grant's testimony was huge, but it's the recording that sealed the deal. What's our next move?" Marcus looked toward the hallway where Officer Grant sat alone on a bench, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. "We need to keep Grant safe," Marcus said quietly. "If Barnes cracks, whoever's behind this could go after him." Alexis's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll make some calls." Marcus nodded, but his focus shifted when the courtroom doors opened and Barnes stormed past, his face red with fury. Patricia trailed behind him, gripping her files so tightly they bent. Marcus knew exactly where Barnes was headed. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals only had two choices: run or lash out. Marcus moved toward the hallway. "Stay here," he told Alexis. Barnes burst into the dimly lit corridor, his footsteps echoing off the walls. Grant stood up defensively when Barnes reached him. "You coward," Barnes hissed, jabbing a finger at Grant's chest. "You think they're going to protect you after this?" Grant's shoulders straightened, though his voice was tight. "I'm done protecting you." Barnes let out a bitter laugh, filled with disbelief and venom. "Do you know what you've done? You think Marcus Hale is some hero who's going to save you? You'll be nothing after this, a scapegoat." Grant flinched but held his ground. "I'd rather be nothing than be you." Barnes's face twisted in rage as he grabbed Grant's collar. Before it could escalate, Marcus's voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Both men turned. Marcus stood a few feet away, calm but resolute. "You lay another hand on him, and you'll be facing charges for assaulting your own partner on top of everything else." Barnes released Grant and took a step back, breathing heavily. His composure was unraveling. "You think you've won?" Barnes sneered. "You have no idea how deep this goes." Marcus's eyes sharpened. "Then enlighten me." For a second, something flashed in Barnes's eyes: hesitation, fear. He glanced down the hall where Patricia was watching, her face unreadable. Then Barnes shook his head and laughed bitterly. "You think this is about me? This is bigger than you or me, Hale." Marcus stepped forward. "Then start talking. Who's pulling the strings?" Barnes's expression hardened. "Not a chance." Two officers approached, motioning for Barnes to return to the courtroom. He turned away without another word, walking down the hall like a man marching toward the gallows. Marcus watched him go, a knot tightening in his gut. Barnes's outburst wasn't a bluff, it was a warning. And if there was one thing Marcus had learned in his career, it was that warnings often came too late. Back in the courtroom, the tension was thicker than before. Marcus took his seat, and as the judge returned, the trial resumed. But this time, the momentum was fully in Marcus's favor. The evidence had spoken louder than any accusation could. Patricia stood to make a final plea, but her confidence was gone. She stumbled through an argument that felt more like an apology. When she finally sat down, there was no applause, no whisper of admiration, just the cold, collective realization that Barnes's fate was sealed. When the verdict came, it was swift. Officer Barnes is found guilty of perjury, abuse of authority, and falsifying evidence. A collective exhale swept through the room. Barnes sat motionless as the words sank in. Marcus remained seated as the reporters swarmed, flashes from their cameras lighting up the courtroom like fireworks. Alexis placed a hand on his shoulder, but he barely felt it. His mind was already somewhere else, piecing together the fragments of Barnes's cryptic words. As Barnes was led away in cuffs, he looked back one last time, his eyes burning with something unspoken. Not anger, not remorse, fear. Outside the courthouse, Marcus stepped into a sea of microphones and cameras. The crowd roared with questions, but he raised a hand, and silence fell. "This trial was never about me," he began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "It's about accountability and justice. But make no mistake, this isn't over." Alexis, standing just behind him, whispered, "You're sure you want to say that?" Marcus nodded. Barnes was just the beginning. As the press conference ended, Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, a text from an unknown number. It read, "You're getting too close." Marcus's chest tightened as he showed the message to Alexis. "Looks like we've got our next lead." Alexis's eyes widened. "Someone's watching us." Marcus pocketed the phone and scanned the street. The headlights of passing cars blurred in the distance. Somewhere out there, someone was still hiding in the shadows, pulling the strings. But not for long. The street outside the courthouse bustled with reporters, activists, and onlookers, but Marcus Hale moved through them like a man on a mission. Alexis hurried to catch up, her heels clicking against the concrete. "You think it's a threat?" she asked, glancing at his phone. The anonymous text still glowed on the screen. "You're getting too close." Marcus's jaw tightened. "It's not just a threat, it's a warning." Alexis folded her arms as they reached his car. "A warning about what?" "Barnes is behind bars. What's left to be afraid of?" Marcus looked up at the towering skyline, the glass windows reflecting the fading afternoon light. "Whoever Barnes is protecting," Alexis frowned. "And you think this person is powerful enough to keep him quiet?" Marcus unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat, his mind racing. Barnes was desperate. He was scared. That means there's someone bigger pulling the strings. He paused before turning to Alexis. "We need to figure out who sent this text." Alexis nodded as she pulled out her laptop and settled into the passenger seat. "I can trace the origin, but if they're smart, they'll have used a burner phone." Marcus started the engine, pulling out into traffic. "Let's hope they made a mistake." Back at Marcus's office, the air was thick with tension. The sound of typing filled the space as Alexis ran the number through every database she had access to. Marcus stood near the window, watching the city stretch out below him. He didn't like waiting. He was a man of action, but in this case, patience was necessary. "Got something," Alexis muttered, her eyes narrowing. Marcus turned quickly. "What is it?" Alexis's fingers flew across the keyboard. "The number traces back to a cell tower downtown close to City Hall." She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples, which means whoever sent this message is operating right in the heart of the city's power. Marcus's brow furrowed. City Hall, or someone connected to Langston's office. The name of State Senator Richard Langston hung in the air like a storm cloud. Langston had been the focus of Marcus's corruption investigation for months. But until now, Marcus had thought the senator was merely corrupt, not someone capable of orchestrating a cover-up involving dirty cops and threats. Alexis's phone buzzed, interrupting the silence. She frowned and held it up. "It's Grant," Marcus nodded. "Put him on speaker." The line crackled before Grant's voice came through, low and shaken. "Marcus, something's wrong." Marcus exchanged a sharp look with Alexis. "What's going on?" "I've been followed," Grant said. There was a rustling sound, as if he was peering around a corner. "A black SUV. No plates. They've been outside my apartment all day." Marcus's pulse quickened. "Get out of there. Don't go home. I'll send someone to meet you." "No time," Grant whispered. "They're coming up the stairs." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Where are you exactly?" Grant's voice was barely above a whisper now. "Third floor. Fire escape. Apartment 3B. "We're coming," Marcus said, already grabbing his keys. "Stay low." The call ended abruptly, leaving a hollow silence in its place. Alexis was already on her feet, stuffing her laptop into her bag. "Do you really think it's them?" she asked as they rushed down the hallway. Marcus's expression was grim. If Barnes was scared of someone, it's because that someone isn't afraid to make people disappear. The drive to Grant's apartment was tense and quiet. Marcus weaved through traffic, his focus razor-sharp. When they arrived at the rundown brick building, the street was eerily quiet. Alexis glanced at the fire escape running along the side. "Third floor." Marcus nodded. They both exited the car, moving quickly but cautiously. Marcus led the way up the metal fire escape, his shoes clanging softly against the steel. As they reached the third floor, Marcus paused outside the window of apartment 3B. The window was slightly ajar, the curtains fluttering faintly. He held up a hand to Alexis, signaling her to stay back. Slowly, he eased the window open and slipped inside. The living room was dark, except for the soft glow of a table lamp. Papers were scattered across the coffee table, police reports, statements, evidence that Grant had been keeping for himself. "Grant?" Marcus called softly. A muffled groan came from behind the couch. Marcus rushed forward and found Grant slumped against the wall, his face pale, a gash bleeding just above his temple. His breathing was shallow, but his eyes fluttered open at the sound of Marcus's voice. They found me," Grant rasped. Marcus knelt down, gripping his shoulder. "You're okay. We've got you." Alexis climbed through the window, her face paling as she saw the blood. "We need to get him to a hospital." Grant's hand weakly gripped Marcus's sleeve. "No, no hospital," he coughed, struggling to sit up. "They'll find me there." Marcus exchanged a troubled glance with Alexis but nodded. "We'll take you somewhere safe." Grant's eyes locked onto Marcus's, wild with fear. "Langston," he whispered. Marcus froze. "What about him?" Grant's voice was weak but clear. "He's the one. Langston. He's behind everything." The room spun with the weight of the revelation. Marcus had suspected Langston, but hearing it confirmed from Grant's lips felt like a blow. "Let's get him out of here," Alexis said urgently. Marcus slid his arm under Grant, helping him to his feet. As they guided him toward the window, the sound of tires screeching outside made them pause. Alexis peeked through the curtain. SUV. No plates. Marcus's heart pounded. They were out of time. The screech of tires echoed through the street below, sending a jolt of adrenaline through Marcus's veins. The black SUV idled near the curb, its tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. Marcus's mind raced as he tightened his grip on Grant, who was still struggling to stay conscious. Alexis pulled back from the window, her face pale but determined. "There's no way out the front." Marcus glanced at the fire escape, then at the narrow alley that ran behind the building. "We'll have to take the back route. If they're watching the front, we can't risk the stairs." Grant's voice was weak, but insistent. "Don't let them get me." Marcus steadied him, locking eyes with Alexis. "We won't." She nodded and grabbed a jacket from the couch, draping it over Grant to hide the bloodstain. Marcus eased the window all the way open, and Alexis climbed through first. Marcus followed, helping Grant as they moved carefully down the steel steps of the fire escape. The alley below was narrow, dimly lit by a single flickering street lamp. As soon as they touched the ground, Marcus scanned the shadows. The SUV hadn't moved, but he knew they didn't have much time. "There's a side street about 2 blocks west," Alexis whispered. "If we can get there, we'll lose them." Marcus nodded and shifted Grant's weight over his shoulder. Grant groaned but clung weakly to Marcus's arm. "Let's move," Marcus said. They hurried down the alley, sticking close to the shadows. The night air was cold, biting through their jackets. The sound of their footsteps was muffled against the asphalt, but the distant hum of an engine reminded Marcus that they were being hunted. Just as they reached the end of the alley, headlights swung toward them, flooding the street with light. "They're circling back," Alexis shouted. Marcus's instincts kicked in. "Go left!" They sprinted toward the side street, but the SUV roared after them, its engine growling as it accelerated. Alexis grabbed a trash can and shoved it into the street behind them, sending it tumbling and scattering garbage. The SUV swerved, but kept coming. Marcus cursed under his breath. Grant's body was getting heavier by the second, his breath shallow against Marcus's shoulder. "There!" Alexis pointed to a narrow driveway between 2 buildings. They darted into the tight space just as the SUV skidded to a stop behind them. Doors slammed, and Marcus heard the heavy thud of footsteps. "Keep moving," Marcus urged, his voice low but firm. The driveway opened into a fenced parking lot, surrounded by chain link and rusting gates. Alexis yanked the gate open, and Marcus slipped through with Grant. They ducked behind an abandoned sedan, the smell of oil and dust thick in the air. Marcus eased Grant down carefully and crouched low, watching as two figures appeared in the dim light. Both were tall, dressed in dark clothing with masks that covered the lower halves of their faces. Alexis's eyes widened. They look military. Marcus's heart thudded in his chest. This wasn't some small-time intimidation tactic. These were professionals. One of the men scanned the area with a flashlight, while the other tapped his earpiece. "Sweep the lot," one of them muttered. Marcus clenched his jaw. If they didn't move soon, they'd be trapped. But running now would only draw attention. Grant coughed softly, and Marcus's eyes darted to the men. The flashlight beam jerked in their direction. "They're over there!" The command was sharp, and the men started toward them. "Run!" Marcus shouted. He and Alexis hauled Grant up again, sprinting toward the far end of the lot. A loud crack echoed through the night, a warning shot. Alexis ducked instinctively. "They're shooting at us!" Marcus spotted an emergency exit door along the building. He rammed into it with his shoulder, the metal groaning before it burst open. "Inside!" he barked. They stumbled into the dark corridor of what looked like an old storage facility. Alexis slammed the door shut behind them and jammed a nearby metal rod into the handle. "We need to get higher," Marcus said. "We can't keep running street level." They found a staircase at the end of the hall and climbed as fast as they could. Grant was barely conscious, his feet dragging as they pulled him along. By the time they reached the second floor, Marcus's arms burned from the weight, but he forced himself to keep going. They found a maintenance room and slipped inside, locking the door behind them. Alexis leaned against the wall, panting. "What? Now?" Marcus knelt beside Grant, checking his pulse. "We hold out until they pass. We can't outrun them with him like this." Grant's eyes fluttered open. His voice was weak but urgent. "It's Langston," he murmured again. Marcus frowned. "We know, but why? What does he want?" Grant's gaze was glassy, but he managed to whisper one last word. "Files." Marcus felt his blood run cold. "Langston's files?" Grant nodded weakly before slipping back into unconsciousness. Alexis's expression was grim. "If Langston's willing to send a kill squad for those files, they must be damning." Marcus rubbed his forehead, trying to piece it all together. "We need to find those files before they do." Suddenly, a loud bang came from the hallway, the sound of a door being kicked open. "They're inside," Alexis whispered, her voice trembling. Marcus's eyes darted toward the narrow window on the far wall. It led to the building's rooftop. "We go up," he said, already moving toward it. Alexis helped Marcus lift Grant as they climbed through the window. The cold night air hit them again as they emerged onto the roof. The city stretched out before them, lights blinking like stars. But below, shadows moved quickly. The hunters weren't far behind. "Whatever's in those files," Marcus muttered as he helped Grant to his feet. "It's worth killing for." Alexis nodded, her gaze hardening. "Then we're going to make sure the whole world sees them." The cold wind whipped across the rooftop as Marcus and Alexis hauled Grant to his feet. The city sprawled out below them, bright lights and moving cars that felt miles away from the danger closing in around them. The distant hum of traffic seemed surreal compared to the pounding footsteps echoing through the building below. Marcus scanned the rooftop. The adjacent building was separated by a narrow alley, no more than 10 feet across. It was their only chance. Alexis followed his gaze and shook her head. "You're kidding, right?" Marcus tightened his grip on Grant, who was barely conscious. "Do you see another way out?" Alexis exhaled sharply, brushing her hair back from her face. "No, but he can't make that jump." "We'll have to carry him," Marcus said firmly. He turned to Grant, giving him a light shake. "Grant, you with me?" Grant's eyes fluttered open, his voice barely a whisper. I can do it." Marcus nodded, though he knew it was a lie. "We'll help you." A loud bang from the stairwell door made them all flinch. The door burst open, and two masked men stepped onto the rooftop, guns raised. "Go!" Marcus shouted. Alexis took off, sprinting toward the edge. Marcus hoisted Grant up, ignoring the searing pain in his arms as they ran. Alexis reached the ledge first and leapt, her body twisting mid-air as she landed hard on the other side, rolling to break the impact. Marcus didn't hesitate. He tightened his grip around Grant and hurled them both forward. The wind rushed past as they soared across the gap. Time seemed to slow until their feet hit the rooftop barely. Marcus stumbled, his knees buckling, but Alexis grabbed Grant's arm, pulling them fully onto the roof. Behind them, the masked men reached the edge and hesitated. "They're not jumping," Alexis said breathlessly. Marcus's stomach twisted. The men weren't retreating. They were stalling. He turned to Alexis. "They're boxing us in." Alexis's face hardened. "Then we need to get off this rooftop now." Marcus's gaze darted to the fire escape ladder at the far corner. "There," he said, pointing. Alexis nodded and helped steady Grant as they hurried across the rooftop. Below, the SUV roared down the alley, its engine echoing between the buildings. "Marcus!" Alexis called, her eyes widening as a second vehicle pulled into the street below. Marcus felt the weight of the moment press down on him. "They're not letting us leave." "Get to the ladder," he commanded. Alexis reached the edge first, holding Grant steady as Marcus climbed down to the second-floor platform. His feet hit the metal grate, and he motioned for them to follow. Just as Alexis swung her leg over the ledge, a gunshot cracked through the night. The bullet struck the wall inches from her shoulder, sending concrete chips flying. Alexis ducked, her breath ragged. "They're shooting again!" Marcus's pulse thundered in his ears. He climbed halfway back up, reaching for Grant. "We have to move!" Alexis pushed Grant forward. The young officer's legs wobbled as Marcus pulled him down the ladder. They reached the ground as tires screeched behind them. Alexis pointed to a darkened alley that branched off from the street. "There!" Marcus wrapped Grant's arm around his shoulder and sprinted. The SUV's headlights swept past, momentarily blinding them, but they kept running until the alley swallowed them in darkness. They slowed only when they reached a small loading dock behind an abandoned warehouse. Marcus eased Grant onto an old wooden crate, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. Alexis pressed her back against the wall, wiping sweat from her brow. "We can't keep this up." Marcus crouched beside Grant, checking his pulse. "We don't have a choice." Grant's eyes fluttered open. His voice was hoarse. "Files, Senator's office." Marcus leaned in closer. "What's in the files, Grant?" Grant's fingers weakly gripped Marcus's wrist. "Proof. Langston's dirty deals. Payoffs. Blackmail." Marcus felt a chill crawl up his spine. "And you've seen them?" Grant nodded faintly. "Hidden. In his private archive. Password protected. But I've seen enough." Alexis knelt down, her face pale. "Langston knows Grant saw them. That's why he's hunting him." Marcus straightened, his mind working quickly. "If we can get those files, we'll have enough to bring Langston down. But we need access to that archive." Grant's breathing was shallow. "The password in my notes, my safe." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Where's the safe?" Grant's eyes drifted closed, but he managed to whisper one last word. "Warehouse. River Street." Alexis leaned in closer. "River Street. That's on the other side of the city." Marcus nodded grimly. "Then that's where we're going." Alexis's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. "I'll call for a safe car." She hesitated. "Marcus, if Langston knows about this place, he'll send everything he's got," Marcus finished. "But we're out of options." Alexis exhaled slowly. "Then let's make it count." As Marcus glanced back down the alley, the weight of what lay ahead settled over him. They weren't just running to survive anymore. They were running to end this. The black sedan sped through the city, its headlights cutting through the foggy streets. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the leather. In the back seat, Grant drifted in and out of consciousness, his pale face illuminated by the occasional passing streetlight. "River Street Warehouse," Alexis said, her voice tense as she studied the map on her phone. "It's tucked between a shipping yard and a set of old train tracks. The perfect place to hide something you don't want found." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Or the perfect place to set a trap." Alexis looked back at Grant, her brow furrowed. "Do you trust him? I mean, he's been complicit in Barnes's schemes until now." Marcus glanced at her, his voice low but firm. "He's risking his life to tell the truth. That counts for something." Alexis sighed. "Let's just hope he's not too late." They arrived at the River Street Warehouse just before midnight. The building loomed like a monolith in the mist, its rusted exterior and broken windows a stark reminder of its abandonment. Marcus parked the car in a shadowed corner, keeping the engine running. "We don't know how many people Langston sent," Marcus said, grabbing the flashlight from the glove box. "Stay alert." Alexis nodded, her hand tightening around the compact stun gun she carried. "Let's make this quick." Marcus helped Grant out of the back seat, slinging the injured officer's arm over his shoulder. Together, they approached the warehouse. The air was damp and heavy, the distant sound of waves crashing against the docks, adding to the eerie stillness. "Doors unlocked," Alexis whispered, pushing it open cautiously. Inside, the warehouse smelled of rust and mildew. Their footsteps echoed off the concrete floor as they moved deeper into the cavernous space. Stacks of old crates and forgotten machinery created a maze of shadows. "Grant," Marcus said, keeping his voice low. "Where's the safe?" Grant weakly gestured toward the far corner. "Office, second floor, hidden panel." Marcus and Alexis exchanged a glance. The upper level of the warehouse was accessible by a set of rickety metal stairs. "Stay here," Marcus said, easing Grant onto an overturned crate. "We'll get the files." Grant nodded weakly, his head resting against the wall. Marcus led the way up the stairs, his flashlight casting long beams through the darkness. The office was small and cluttered, its single desk covered in a layer of dust. Alexis moved to the far wall, running her fingers along the panels. "He said it's hidden." "There." She tapped against the wood until a hollow sound rang out. "Here," she said, pulling at the panel. The hidden compartment slid open to reveal a small safe. Marcus crouched down, inspecting the keypad. "Do you have the combination?" Alexis asked. Marcus hesitated, his mind flashing back to Grant's whispered words. He punched in the code, 0723. The safe clicked open. Inside was a stack of folders and a USB drive. Marcus grabbed everything and stuffed them into his bag. "Let's go," he said. As they descended the stairs, a faint noise stopped them in their tracks, a soft creak, like the sound of a footstep on metal. Alexis froze. "Did you hear that?" Marcus nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for his pocket knife. A second later, the warehouse exploded with light. Floodlights blazed from all sides, blinding them momentarily. "Drop the bag," a voice commanded. Marcus squinted, his heart pounding. 4 men in tactical gear emerged from the shadows, their rifles trained on him and Alexis. The leader of the group stepped forward, his voice cold. "Hand over the files, Mr. Hale. This doesn't have to get messy." Marcus's grip on the bag tightened. "And if I don't?" The man smirked. "Then we add 3 more bodies to Langston's list." Alexis shot Marcus a look, her hand inching toward her stun gun. "What now?" she whispered. Marcus's mind raced. He couldn't let the files fall into Langston's hands, but they were outgunned and outnumbered. "Stall them," he murmured. "Time's up," the leader barked, raising his rifle. Suddenly, a loud metallic crash echoed from the far side of the warehouse. Everyone turned toward the noise as Grant stumbled out from behind a stack of crates, his face pale but determined. "Get away from them!" he shouted, holding a piece of rebar like a weapon. The distraction was enough. Marcus lunged forward, tossing the bag to Alexis. "Run!" he yelled. Chaos erupted. The men turned their weapons on Grant, who swung the rebar wildly, forcing them to back up. Marcus tackled the nearest guard, knocking the rifle from his hands. "Go, Alexis!" Marcus shouted again. Alexis sprinted toward the exit, clutching the bag tightly. Gunfire erupted, bullets sparking against the metal walls as she ducked and weaved through the maze of crates. Marcus threw a punch, his fist connecting with another guard's jaw. Grant staggered but kept swinging, his movements desperate but effective. The leader of the group shouted orders, his frustration evident. "Don't let them get away!" Outside, Alexis burst into the open air, her chest heaving. She spotted the car and sprinted toward it, throwing the bag into the back seat before climbing in herself. Moments later, Marcus appeared, dragging Grant behind him. Blood streaked Marcus's shirt, but his expression was fierce. "Drive!" he yelled as he shoved Grant into the back seat. Alexis didn't hesitate. She slammed her foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the car tore away from the warehouse. In the rearview mirror, Marcus watched as the remaining men spilled out of the building, shouting and firing wildly into the night. As they sped through the empty streets, Marcus leaned back, his breathing heavy. He looked at Alexis, who clutched the wheel tightly. "Did you get it?" she asked. Marcus reached into the bag and pulled out the USB drive. He held it up, its sleek surface gleaming in the dim light. "We got it," he said. Alexis exhaled, relief washing over her face. In the back seat, Grant's weak voice broke the silence. "They'll never stop." Marcus turned, his jaw set. "Neither will we." The small apartment Alexis had secured as their safe house was dimly lit, its plain walls and minimal furnishings making it the perfect hideout. Outside, the city buzzed with activity, unaware of the storm brewing within. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, the USB drive in his hand. He stared at it, as if the tiny device held all the answers he'd been chasing. Across from him, Alexis had her laptop open, ready to extract whatever information it contained. "You're sure this is it?" Alexis asked, her voice low. Marcus nodded. Grant wouldn't have risked everything if it wasn't. Grant, lying on the couch with a bandage hastily wrapped around his shoulder, groaned weakly. "You don't have much time," he muttered. "Langston's people. They won't stop." Marcus clenched his jaw. "They'll stop once we expose him." Alexis inserted the USB drive into her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The screen flashed to life, revealing a folder labeled Confidential. She clicked it open, and a series of files appeared: emails, financial records, and what looked like blackmail material. "This is it," Alexis breathed. She clicked on one of the emails and read aloud. "To Senator Langston, payment confirmed. Additional support will arrive next week. Ensure local law enforcement compliance." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "He's paying off law enforcement to suppress investigations." Alexis opened another file, a spreadsheet detailing payment to various officials. Names of police officers, judges, and even city council members were listed alongside staggering amounts of money. "He's running a network of corruption," Alexis said, her voice trembling. "This goes way beyond Barnes. Langston has people in every corner of the system." Marcus's mind raced. If these files went public, Langston's entire operation would collapse. But it also meant they were holding a ticking time bomb, one that could make them the next targets. "We need to get this out," Marcus said. "Immediately." Alexis nodded. "We can leak it to the press. I know a few reporters who'll run with it." Grant stirred, his voice weak but insistent. "Be careful. Someone's watching." Marcus glanced at him, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Grant's eyes fluttered open. "There's a mole. Someone close to you." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Alexis froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "A mole?" Grant nodded faintly. "Langston has someone on your side." Marcus felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. He looked at Alexis, who met his gaze with wide, alarmed eyes. "That's impossible," Alexis said. "We've been careful. No one else knows what we're doing." But Marcus wasn't so sure. Langston's network was too well organized, too efficient. Every time they gained ground, someone had been one step ahead. His mind raced through the possibilities, but there was no time to dwell. The files were the priority. "Let's secure the data first," Marcus said, his voice steady. "We'll deal with the mole after." Alexis nodded reluctantly and began encrypting the files for transmission. As the upload progressed, a faint noise caught Marcus's attention. He held up a hand, motioning for silence. The sound grew louder, a faint scrape, like someone trying to move quietly. Marcus's stomach dropped. "We've been found." He grabbed a nearby lamp and turned off the light, plunging the apartment into darkness. Alexis quickly shut her laptop, slipping it into her bag. "Get Grant," Marcus whispered. Alexis moved to the couch, helping the injured officer to his feet. Marcus crept toward the window, peeking through the blinds. A black SUV idled on the street below. 3 figures in dark clothing were approaching the building, their movements deliberate. "They're here," Marcus said. "Back exit?" Alexis whispered. Marcus nodded. "Take the files and go. I'll hold them off." Alexis's eyes widened. "No, we stick together." "We can't risk losing the files," Marcus insisted. "Get Grant out of here." Reluctantly, Alexis helped Grant toward the back door. She paused, looking back at Marcus. "Be careful." Marcus nodded, then moved to position himself near the front door. The lock rattled, then clicked. The door creaked open, and a masked man stepped inside, his weapon raised. Marcus waited until the man was fully inside, then swung a chair leg he'd grabbed from the kitchen. The blow connected, sending the man sprawling. "Upstairs!" one of the others shouted from outside. Marcus bolted for the back exit, slamming the door behind him. He sprinted down the narrow alley, his breath coming in sharp bursts. Ahead, Alexis was helping Grant into the sedan. Marcus dove into the passenger seat as Alexis floored the gas pedal. The SUV gave chase, its headlights glaring in the rear-view mirror. "They're gaining on us," Alexis said, her voice tight. "Head for the freeway," Marcus instructed. Alexis swerved through traffic, narrowly avoiding collisions. The SUV stayed close, its driver relentless. Marcus glanced back at Grant, who was slumped in the seat, barely conscious. "Hang on, Grant. We're almost there." Alexis veered onto the freeway, weaving between cars. The SUV struggled to keep up in the heavy traffic, and Marcus saw their chance. "Take the next exit and double back," he said. Alexis nodded, gripping the wheel tightly. She took the exit at the last second, the SUV missing the turn. They drove in silence for several minutes, finally pulling into the parking lot of a closed diner. Marcus exhaled, his muscles tense. "We're safe, for now." Alexis handed him the laptop. "The files are uploaded. The press will have them by morning." Marcus leaned back, the weight of the night settling on him. Langston's empire is about to crumble. But as they sat in the dark, the words of Grant's warning echoed in Marcus's mind. "There's a mole, someone close to you." He looked at Alexis, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone as she sent the files to their contacts. She had been his ally through everything. But now, a sliver of doubt crept into his thoughts. Was she the one Langston had planted? The storm is far from over, but the truth is finally coming to light. Marcus Hale has uncovered the depths of corruption, but with betrayal lurking closer than ever, his battle for justice is about to reach its most dangerous chapter yet. Will he expose Langston's empire? Or will the mole in his circle bring it all crashing down? To find out what happens next, make sure to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for the next thrilling installment. Justice is a journey, and you won't want to miss the twists and turns ahead. Hit the notification bell to stay updated. and thank you for being part of this story. Together, let's shine a light on the shadows. See you in the next episode.